the scent of burning incense mixed with fish sauce and cordite as 19 Viet Cong sappers crouched in a Saigon alley, their black albar pajamas still damp from crawling through storm drains that reeked of stagnant water and human waste. This moment, 2:47 a.m. on January 31st, 1968, would shatter America's confidence in a war they thought they were winning. The Tet Offensive wasn't just another battle. It was a coordinated symphony of violence designed to prove that no American stronghold, no matter how heavily fortified, was truly safe. For those who lived through it, the offensive revealed that wars aren't won by body counts or superior firepower, but by the will to endure unimaginable suffering for an idea worth dying for. Months before that fateful night, in the humid meeting rooms of COSVN headquarters deep in the Cambodian jungle, Trun Van Tra had spread maps across bamboo tables while mosquitoes hummed through the canopy overhead. The Central Office for South Vietnam had received directives from Hanoi, a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. Le Duan's Politburo wanted nothing less than a general offensive and uprising that would strike over 100 towns and bases simultaneously across South Vietnam. Whether Giap himself endorsed this strategy remains a matter historians debate, but the machine was already in motion. The numbers were staggering: 80,000 to 84,000 fighters committed to the first wave alone, not the seasoned PAVN regulars from the north, but largely southern Viet Cong farmers' sons and market vendors who had learned to kill with homemade grenades stuffed in bamboo tubes and AK-47s cached beneath family altars. They would target 36 of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals, 5 of 6 autonomous cities, and dozens of district capitals within hours of each other. In Saigon's sprawling neighborhoods, the preparation had been meticulous and invisible. For weeks, fighters wearing the rubber tire-tread sandals called Dep Lop had moved weapons through the city disguised as Tet celebrants. Rifles and RPGs disappeared into pagodas, market stalls, and safe houses, some hidden beneath traditional gift baskets filled with sticky rice, ban tate, and mandarin oranges. A taxi driver in Chur Lone packed his trunk with explosives beneath a layer of fruit, planning to ram a police post until traffic, that eternal curse of urban warfare, stopped him cold. The infiltration methods read like a spy novel written in blood. Sapper squads crawled along sewers, their bodies covered in kerosene to ward off leeches, bicycle tube strips binding their pant legs tight. Others moved in funeral processions or simply walked the streets as mourners, their weapons wrapped in burial shrouds. In one Cholon family's home, 14 rifles and 300 rounds lay beneath an ancestor altar for an entire month, while the family ate their daily meals just feet above an arsenal that could arm a platoon. Women and teenagers served as couriers, moving pistols and coded messages in conical hats and baby cradles. Some commanded entire sapper cells in the maze-like alleys, where chalk arrows and peeled paint symbols marked rally points behind shuttered shop fronts. These fighters had memorized every backstreet like prayers, studying the city's circulatory system until they could navigate blind through neighborhoods where the wrong turn meant death. The timing exploited South Vietnam's holiest holiday. During Tet truces, many ARVN soldiers had gone home to light incense at family shrines and share meals beneath red banners that decorated every street. The Viet Cong counted on this, that the sound of gunfire might be mistaken for banned firecrackers, buying precious minutes of confusion as their assault teams moved into position. But COSVN's masterstroke wasn't just the coordination, it was the deception. While America's eyes fixed on Khe Sanh, where PAVN artillery had been pounding Marines since January 21st, the real blow was preparing to fall on the cities. Viet Cong cadres called Khe Sanh the Northwest Drum, a thunderous distraction masking the city strike in the lowlands where South Vietnam's government actually lived and breathed. In the Delta region, local forces prepared to strike My Tho, Cun Thơ, Vien Long, and Ben Tre around 2 or 3 in the morning, when river fog would muffle the sound of sampans poled through nipa palms. Their fighters carried Soviet and Chinese radios rationed to minutes per hour, supplemented by runners who could slip between villages like ghosts. They cooked rice on Hoang Cum, smokeless stoves, seasoning it with fish sauce carried in reused IV bottles, a detail that spoke to both their resourcefulness and the medical equipment they'd captured or stolen. Can you imagine the weight of carrying such secrets? These fighters knew they were about to attempt something that could end the war or destroy them completely. The night of January 30th, as families across South Vietnam prepared for the Year of the Monkey, sappers checked their equipment one final time. Satchel charges, wire cutters, homemade fuses cut to 3 or 4 seconds by candlelight and knife. Some carried pre-printed surrender passes to hand ARVN soldiers, genuinely believing that once the shooting started, the South Vietnamese army would simply melt away. If you're enjoying this glimpse into one of the most pivotal moments of the Vietnam War, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from history's shadows. And let me know in the comments what other perspectives from this conflict would you want to explore. At exactly 2:47 a.m. on January 31st, those 19 sappers in the Saigon alley rose from their crouch and began moving toward the most heavily guarded building in South Vietnam, the United States Embassy. The explosion that blew a jagged hole through the embassy's perimeter wall sent chunks of concrete and bougainvillea petals spinning through the darkness like deadly confetti. The 19-man sapper squad had just announced to the world that America's most protected sanctuary in Saigon was as vulnerable as any village hut. For the next 5 to 6 hours, these fighters, most barely out of their teens, would transform the manicured embassy grounds into a killing field that would be broadcast into American living rooms within 48 hours, shattering the illusion that this war was under control. The embassy assault began with methodical precision. The sappers had studied the compound for weeks, memorizing guard rotations and identifying weak points in the perimeter. Their leader carried wire cutters and a satchel charge powerful enough to breach reinforced concrete. Behind him, fighters hefted B-40 rocket launchers and AK-47s, their tire-tread sandals silent against the pavement, still warm from the day's heat. The smell of jasmine from nearby gardens mixed with gun oil and the acrid bite of plastic explosives. As debris settled in the courtyard, Marine guards inside the embassy compound scrambled to defensive positions, the crack of rifle fire punctuating shouts in both English and Vietnamese. The attackers moved through the breach like water flowing through a broken dam, taking cover behind concrete planters and decorative fountains that had been designed for diplomats' garden parties, not urban warfare. But the embassy was just one note in a symphony of violence erupting across Saigon. At precisely the same moment, 600 to 800 Viet Cong fighters were launching their assault on Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the largest military installation in South Vietnam. ARVN airborne troops and American armor rushed to counterattack, but the sound of heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades echoed across runways where C-130 transport planes sat like sitting ducks. In downtown Saigon, another sapper team moved through pre-dawn shadows toward the national radio station. COSVN planners had identified this target as crucial. Whoever controlled the airwaves could announce the uprising and call for South Vietnamese soldiers to lay down their arms. The assault team carried a pre-recorded tape declaring the liberation of Saigon, confident they would soon broadcast revolutionary songs across the entire country. What they didn't know was that ARVN engineers had been busy. In a stroke of paranoid brilliance, or perhaps just standard military pessimism, South Vietnamese demolition experts had pre-wired the building with enough explosives to level a city block. The moment Viet Cong fighters burst through the station's doors, clutching their propaganda tape like a winning lottery ticket, someone pressed a detonator. The building simply vanished in a thunderclap that rattled windows for miles, taking the attackers and their revolutionary message with it. The irony was perfect and horrible. The Viet Cong had seized the means to announce their victory, only to be silenced forever by the very regime they sought to overthrow. Across the city, similar scenes played out in a deadly choreography of urban warfare. Independence Palace, the seat of South Vietnamese government, came under attack as sapper teams emerged from storm drains like deadly phantoms. The crack of rifle fire echoed through streets decorated with red Tet banners, where spent brass casings mixed with fallen apricot blossoms in a grotesque parody of celebration. The early confusion worked exactly as planned. In multiple Saigon wards, the first bursts of automatic weapons fire were dismissed as illegal Tet firecrackers, giving Viet Cong patrols an extra 5 to 10 minutes of precious confusion time. Families huddled behind altar tables and brick water jars, uncertain whether they were hearing celebration or slaughter. Some civilians peered through shuttered windows, watching tracer rounds streak between buildings like malevolent fireflies. At the embassy, the siege had settled into a deadly stalemate. Marine guards, armed with M16s and grenades, held the main building while sappers controlled portions of the courtyard. Every few minutes, the sharp crack of a rifle would punctuate longer periods of tense silence. The attackers knew they couldn't hold the position indefinitely, but that wasn't the point. Every minute they kept fighting was another minute of footage for American television cameras that would arrive with the dawn. The logistics behind this coordination boggled the mind. Viet Cong radio networks used code names like Bamboo, River, and Market, with batteries rationed so strictly that 9 squads shared just 5 radios. Runners carried messages through alleyways where women played Dantran traditional zithers to mask the slosh of gun oil in hidden rain barrels. The musical notes drifted through the gunfire like ghostly accompaniment to urban warfare. In Chulun, the city's Chinese quarter, firefights erupted in narrow streets between market stalls. The Phu Thought racetrack, normally filled with gamblers and horse racing, transformed overnight into a landing zone for medical helicopters and a casualty collection point. The sweet smell of incense from Chinese temples mixed with diesel exhaust and the copper taste of blood as medics worked under improvised floodlights. By dawn, 18 of the 19 embassy attackers lay dead among the ruins of the compound's decorative garden. The sole survivor, wounded and half-conscious, would be photographed by Associated Press cameramen as MPs dragged him away. Those images of a young Vietnamese fighter bleeding onto manicured grass beneath the American flag would appear on front pages across the United States within hours. Consider the weight of that moment. 19 farmers' sons had just proven that America's fortress capital was no fortress at all. The embassy courtyard looked like a scene from hell. Satchel charge fragments glittered among shattered bougainvillea petals, while the morning sun illuminated blood spatters on concrete walls built to project American power. MPs counted the bodies twice, unable to believe so few attackers had held out for so long against overwhelming firepower. But as embassy staff swept up the debris and tried to restore order, reports flooded in from across South Vietnam that made the Saigon attacks look like a mere opening act. 10,000 PAVN and Viet Cong fighters moved through Hugh's winter drizzle like ghosts reclaiming a forgotten kingdom, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old brick dust and the soft patter of rain on imperial roof tiles. The seizure of South Vietnam's ancient capital before dawn on January 31st represented the offensive's most ambitious target, a city whose capture would resonate far beyond military significance. Hue wasn't just another provincial capital, it was the soul of Vietnamese culture, home to the Forbidden Purple City and the tombs of emperors. For the attackers, emerging from the mist, this wasn't conquest, it was homecoming. The assault began in darkness so complete that fighters navigated by touch and memory. PAVN regulars and local Viet Cong had infiltrated through networks of canals and ancient drainage tunnels that honeycombed the city like arteries in a stone heart. The temperature hovered around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, cold enough that breath misted in the air, but warm enough for the persistent drizzle that would define the battle for weeks to come. Within hours, the attackers controlled the massive citadel, the walled imperial compound that dominated the city's northern bank. Liberation flags fluttered from the Ngo Mon Gate, where emperors once received tribute from distant provinces. But this wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was strategic brilliance. From the citadel's walls, the Viet Cong could dominate most of Hue, while forcing American and South Vietnamese forces to assault fortifications built to withstand centuries of warfare. The house-to-house fighting that followed defied every principle of modern military doctrine. Sapper teams used satchel charges to blast through barricaded doors, then marked cleared rooms with chalk symbols that told following units whether buildings were secure, booby-trapped, or still contested. The sound of explosions echoed off ancient walls while fighters moved through courtyards where incense ash mixed with brick dust under their rubber-soled boots. American Marines and ARVN soldiers found themselves fighting in temple complexes, where golden Buddhas watched the slaughter with serene indifference. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with sandalwood incense that had burned for generations, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where sacred and profane merged into something beyond both. Fighters used incense sticks as timing devices. One stick burned for 30 to 40 minutes, perfect for coordinating assaults or marking guard rotations. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers south, the battle for Tan Son Nhut Air Base had reached its climax. The 600 to 800 Viet Cong attackers had launched their assault with the precision of a Swiss watch, but American and ARVN forces responded with devastating firepower. ARVN airborne troops, many rushed from their Tet leave, fought alongside American armor in a mechanized ballet of violence that left the base perimeter littered with bodies. The mathematics of the assault were brutal and simple. By dawn, over 300 Viet Cong fighters lay dead outside the airbase's chain-link fences, their black pajamas soaked with blood and morning dew. They had achieved tactical surprise but lacked the heavy weapons needed to breach prepared positions defended by tanks and artillery. The attack succeeded in its broader purpose, proving that even America's largest military installation wasn't safe, but the cost in Southern Revolutionary lives was catastrophic. Across the Mekong Delta, the offensive's tentacles reached into every major population center. Local forces struck My Tho, Can Tho, Vinh Long, and Ben Tre around 2 or 3 in the morning, when river fog provided perfect concealment for sampans loaded with fighters and weapons. These weren't main force PAVN units, but local guerrillas who knew every canal and hamlet like their own heartbeat. The Delta attacks followed patterns perfected through years of guerrilla warfare. Fighters wrapped their rifles in oiled cloth against brackish spray as they poled through nipper palms, their movements synchronized by whispered commands and hand signals. Canvas muffled outboard motor clatter, while assault teams approached their targets through waterways that had carried rice and fish for centuries, now serving as highways for revolution. But the offensive's success created its own problems. In many areas, Viet Cong units had achieved their objectives so quickly they found themselves holding territory they couldn't defend. Urban cadres trained for sabotage and assassination suddenly had to govern neighborhoods while under constant counterattack. Some districts levied improvised Tet war taxes, a few piastres per market stall, or a basket of rice per family to fund operations they hadn't expected to survive long enough to require funding. The human cost was mounting exponentially. In Hue, security sections compiled arrest lists of officials and collaborators, a process that would later become a political firestorm when mass graves containing approximately 2,800 victims were discovered. Historians still debate the circumstances of these deaths, but the reality on the ground was chaos punctuated by summary executions and score settling that had been suppressed for years. Combat rations told their own story of preparation and improvisation. Many fighters carried 2 or 3 pieces of sticky rice ban tet from family altars, traditional Tet food that doubled as emergency rations. The banana leaf wrappers served as kindling or field dressings when medical supplies ran low. Some units subsisted on hurried offerings grabbed from temple altars, bananas, pomelos, and sugarcane, eaten while mortar rounds thumped beyond ancient walls. The fighting in Hue developed its own terrible rhythm. Marines and ARVN soldiers advanced through temple courtyards, their radio chatter mixing with the sound of automatic weapons and the crash of falling masonry. Wet incense, ash, and brick dust clung to everything, creating a gritty pace that worked its way into weapons, uniforms, and wounds. The city's historic buildings, some dating back centuries, crumbled under the weight of modern warfare, each shell impact destroying irreplaceable pieces of Vietnamese heritage. As February began, the pattern was becoming clear across South Vietnam. The Viet Cong had achieved tactical surprise on a scale that shocked the world, but they were paying for it with casualties that threatened to destroy the Southern Revolutionary movement entirely. The question that haunted both sides as the battles raged was simple. Could the attackers hold what they had seized long enough for the promised uprising to materialize? Propaganda teams crept through Saigon's back alleys clutching pre-printed surrender passes like holy relics, their pockets bulging with leaflets promising swift collapse of the South Vietnamese regime. But the city's streets remained conspicuously empty of cheering crowds. The Tong Kong Kich, Tong Koring Year, General Offensive and Uprising, had delivered spectacular military surprise, but the second half of that equation was proving devastatingly elusive. COSVN planners had staked everything on the belief that South Vietnamese civilians would rise en masse once they saw Viet Cong fighters in the streets. Instead, families huddled behind brick water jars and altar tables, treating the revolution like just another disaster to survive. In Cholon, where street markets had transformed into firefights, Viet Cong political officers moved from house to house with surrender passes designed for ARVN soldiers. The papers, printed weeks in advance with optimistic slogans, promised amnesty and integration into the liberation forces. Some civilians collected them as grim keepsakes, but the mass defections never materialized. ARVN units, despite taking heavy casualties, largely held their positions and continued fighting. The reality on the ground bore little resemblance to the uprising COSVN had envisioned. Instead of crowds streaming into the streets to support their liberators, Viet Cong fighters found themselves isolated in hostile urban terrain, fighting a conventional battle they were neither equipped nor trained to win. The black pajamas and tire-tread sandals that served them well in jungle warfare made them stand out like targets in city streets, where every civilian might be an informant. Individual fighters began writing letters that would later provide haunting insight into their state of mind. One sapper described 3 nights, no sleep, and mosquito nets black with soot. Another wrote of rice tasting of cordite on the tongue, a detail that captured both the physical reality of combat and the way violence permeated every aspect of life during those first weeks of February. These weren't professional soldiers describing tactical situations, they were farmers' sons trying to make sense of urban warfare's particular hell. The medical situation deteriorated rapidly as the offensive dragged on. Viet Cong medical kits contained sulfur powder, green tea, and reused morphine syrettes, a mixture of traditional remedies, and captured American supplies that spoke to both resourcefulness and desperation. Severe wounds were often treated in commandeered kitchens, where fighters bled onto cooking surfaces while medics worked by candlelight. The sweet smell of traditional medicine mixed with the metallic stench of blood and the acrid bite of antiseptic. In Hue, the battle had settled into a nightmare of attrition that consumed both sides. Fighters moved through ancient courtyards where wet incense ash created treacherous footing, their movements tracked by snipers positioned in pagoda towers and temple complexes. The city's maze-like structure favored defenders, but it also trapped attackers who found themselves cut off from resupply lines stretching back to the countryside. The 21 SPAVN Regiment had established command posts in the Citadel's imperial buildings, using structures built for emperors to coordinate attacks against forces equipped with jet aircraft and artillery. The irony wasn't lost on fighters who sheltered in rooms where generations of Vietnamese rulers had planned their own campaigns against foreign invaders. History folded in on itself as automatic weapons chattered in courtyards where mandarins once composed poetry. Communication between units relied increasingly on runners who memorized alley networks like prayers. Chalk arrows and peeled paint symbols marked rally points behind shuttered shop fronts, but the symbols meant nothing if the runners carrying messages were killed or captured. Some districts lost contact entirely with higher command, leaving local cell leaders to make life-and-death decisions based on rumor and the sound of distant gunfire. The logistical nightmare of urban warfare became apparent in ways COSVN planners had never anticipated. Fighters accustomed to living off the land found themselves trapped in concrete environments where every meal required careful planning. Units that controlled markets could eat well, but those pinned down in residential areas often went hungry. Some subsisted on offerings grabbed hurriedly from family altars, 5 fruit trays traditionally left for ancestors now feeding revolution's desperate children. Radio discipline collapsed under pressure as batteries died and operators were killed or wounded. The careful code names Bamboo, River, Market gave way to frantic plaintext transmissions that American intelligence units intercepted and exploited. What had begun as a coordinated offensive was fragmenting into dozens of separate battles fought by increasingly isolated units. The promised tearing of the pacification net was occurring, but not in ways that benefited the attackers. Rural hamlets dutifully cut telephone lines and erected bamboo caltrops on access roads, but these actions often isolated Viet Cong units in urban areas from the countryside that had sustained them for years. The offensive's success in disrupting communications worked both ways, leaving fighters uncertain whether their sacrifices were part of a broader victory or a catastrophic miscalculation. In Saigon, ARVN tanks clanked through boulevards lined with fallen apricot blossoms and spent brass casings, a surreal mixture of New Year celebration and urban warfare. The Joint General Staff compound had been probed but held, though the psychological impact of the attack resonated far beyond its tactical failure. South Vietnamese officers, who had considered the capital secure, now slept with weapons beside their beds. Individual acts of heroism and desperation played out across the battle zone. A sapper in rubber sandals slid under an Amone 113 armored personnel carrier, with a satchel charge as tracer rounds stitched patterns in the dust around him. The explosion flipped the vehicle onto a fruit cart in a grotesque parody of Market Day, but the sapper's fate disappeared into the chaos of urban combat. His story survived only in American after-action reports that recorded the incident without naming the man who died for it. The human mathematics of the offensive were becoming clear, and they were catastrophic for the Southern Revolutionary Movement. As February deepened and the initial shock wore off, both sides began counting costs that would reshape the war's trajectory in ways none of the planners had anticipated. The smell of cordite and rotting flesh hung over Hugh's imperial gardens like a funeral shroud as Marines counted enemy bodies floating in ornamental ponds where lotus blossoms had once bloomed for Vietnamese emperors. By the end of February 1968, the mathematics of the Tet Offensive had become a ledger written in blood numbers so staggering they would reshape both armies for the remainder of the war. The Viet Cong had achieved their strategic objective of shocking American public opinion, but the price paid in Southern revolutionary lives approached genocide. 30,000 Viet Cong and PAVN fighters lay dead across South Vietnam's battlefields, with another 5,000 to 6,000 captured, representing the virtual destruction of the insurgency's local infrastructure built over decades of patient organizing. In comparison, American forces suffered approximately 3,800 killed in action, while ARVN losses reached near 5,000 heavy casualties that nonetheless paled beside the carnage inflicted on the attackers. The disparity revealed the fundamental miscalculation at COISVN's heart. Urban warfare against prepared positions demanded conventional military strength the Viet Cong simply didn't possess. Individual unit losses told the story in human terms that transcended statistics. Viet Cong morale letters, intercepted by American intelligence, mixed pride in surprising the Americans in their beds, with grief over squads reduced from 12 fighters to 3 in a single dawn. One sapper wrote of walking through his home village after the offensive and finding it empty, not just of people, but of the entire generation of young men who had answered the call for general uprising. The battle for Hue finally ended in March, after weeks of house-to-house fighting that destroyed or damaged thousands of historic buildings. American Marines and ARVN 1st Division troops advanced through temple complexes, where incense ash mixed with brick dust created a gritty paste that coated everything. Weapons, uniforms, and the shallow graves hastily dug in monastery gardens. The city that had been Vietnam's cultural heart now resembled a moonscape punctuated by the skeletal remains of pagodas and imperial palaces. But even as the immediate offensive sputtered to its bloody conclusion, COISVN planners were already preparing follow-up attacks. The May mini-Tet Offensive would strike again with diminished forces, followed by another wave in August 1968. These subsequent assaults lacked the shock value and coordination of the original, but they demonstrated the Northern leadership's willingness to sacrifice what remained of the Southern revolutionary movement to maintain psychological pressure on American public opinion. The cumulative effect was catastrophic for Viet Cong infrastructure. By year's end, total VC and PAVN killed in action for 1968 exceeded 50,000 across all phases of the offensive. Entire districts found themselves without local cadres, forcing COISVN to increasingly rely on Northern main force units to fill gaps in the revolutionary ranks. The black pajamas and tire-tread sandals of Southern guerrillas gradually gave way to the olive-drab uniforms and rubber boots of PAVN regulars, a shift that would define the war's final years. Surviving Southern cadres wrote letters home that captured the transformation in stark terms. Village committees that had once coordinated local uprisings now posted lists of the fallen on banyan trees, names inked with bamboo pens, 5 to 10 per hamlet. The revolutionary culture that had sustained the insurgency for over a decade was bleeding out in urban streets, far from the rice paddies and jungle bases where it had been born. The offensive's strategic success became apparent, not on Vietnamese battlefields but in American living rooms. Television footage from Saigon and Hue aired within 24 to 48 hours of the attacks, bringing images of urban warfare directly into homes across the United States. The sight of American Marines fighting room to room in ancient Vietnamese palaces shattered the narrative of steady progress that had sustained public support for the war. Walter Cronkite's February 27th broadcast marked the psychological turning point. When America's most trusted newsman declared the war a stalemate on national television, he gave voice to doubts that had been building across the country. The offensive had failed to spark the promised uprising in South Vietnam, but it achieved something far more valuable from Hanoi's perspective. It broke American confidence in their government's war aims. The political earthquake reached its climax on March 31st, when President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election and would limit bombing of North Vietnam. The same farmers' sons who had died in Saigon streets and Hue's courtyards had succeeded in toppling an American president, a victory none of them lived to see. For individual fighters, survival often meant confronting trauma that would last lifetimes. Viet Cong diaries describe the texture of Tet lantern silk snagged on barbed wire and the taste of rain-diluted rice eaten while mortars thumped beyond temple walls. These weren't military after-action reports, but personal testimonies to experiences that defied comprehension. One fighter described hiding in a Cholon family's house, where weapons were stored in rain barrels, while the daughter played Dan Tran to mask the slosh of gun oil during ARVN searches. The musical notes that had once celebrated Tet now served as camouflage for revolution, transforming traditional culture into an instrument of war. Such moments captured the way the offensive had perverted everything it touched, turning celebration into slaughter and family homes into arsenals. The human cost extended beyond combatants to Vietnamese civilians caught between armies. In Saigon, streets reeked of fish sauce, diesel fuel, and burned electrical insulation, a mixture of ordinary life and modern warfare that lingered in survivors' memories for decades. Shell-scarred balconies shed plaster dust onto bicycle spokes, while families swept debris that included both festival decorations and artillery fragments. The offensive's aftermath revealed uncomfortable truths about revolutionary warfare that Cos Vien had either ignored or miscalculated. Urban populations didn't automatically support insurgents simply because they opposed the government. They supported whoever could provide security and stability. The Viet Cong's tactical success in seizing territory meant nothing if they couldn't govern it effectively or protect civilians from counterattacks. Finance cadres discovered the mundane realities of revolution when they tried to collect Tet war taxes from market stalls and family businesses. A few piastres here, a basket of rice there, but these improvised levies generated resentment rather than support, especially when the fighters collecting them might be dead or gone within days. As spring arrived in 1968, the strategic landscape had shifted irreversibly. The Viet Cong had proven they could strike anywhere in South Vietnam, but they had also revealed the limits of their strength. The question that haunted both sides was whether this Pyrrhic victory had shortened the war or simply ensured it would be fought with different armies using different methods. Surviving Viet Cong fighters stripped the black pajamas from their dead comrades and pulled on olive-drab uniforms taken from PAVN supply caches, the rough cotton still smelling of North Vietnamese factories and the long journey down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This transformation from southern guerrillas in traditional peasant clothing to uniformed soldiers indistinguishable from their northern counterparts marked the death of something irreplaceable in the Vietnamese Revolution. The Tet Offensive had consumed not just fighters but an entire culture of resistance rooted in local villages and family networks stretching back generations. What emerged from the ashes was a different kind of war, fought by different kinds of soldiers, using methods that would have been unthinkable just months before. In June 1968, General Creighton Abrams replaced William Westmoreland as commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, bringing with him a radically different approach to counterinsurgency. Where Westmoreland had pursued large unit operations designed to inflict maximum casualties, Abrams emphasized one war pacification smaller, more targeted operations aimed at protecting villages rather than simply killing guerrillas. Surviving Viet Cong cadres noticed the change immediately in the form of tighter cordon sweeps and more frequent patrols that made movement between hamlets increasingly dangerous. The shift in American tactics coincided with Cos Vien's forced adaptation to catastrophic losses. Northern main force units increasingly filled gaps left by decimated southern formations, but these PAVN regulars brought their own military culture shaped by years of fighting conventional battles against French and American forces. The flexible, improvisational methods that had sustained southern guerrillas gave way to stricter radio procedures, more formal command structures, and uniform regulations that would have seemed absurd to fighters who had spent years living in tunnels and jungle camps. Individual stories captured the human dimension of this transformation. A sapper who had survived the embassy assault wrote of receiving new equipment from the north, captured American jungle boots with harder soles, and the distinctive smell of oil and rubber that marked them as prized items among urban infiltration teams. The boots represented more than just better footwear. They symbolized the increasing professionalization of a movement that had once prided itself on making do with tire-tread sandals and captured equipment. Training methods evolved to reflect harsh lessons learned in urban combat. Sapper schools now stressed silence in new ways. Wire-cutting drills conducted in ankle-deep water, 100-meter belly crawls through mud, and two-breath detonator counts practiced under ponchos to simulate the claustrophobic conditions of city warfare. The romantic image of guerrillas living off the land gave way to technical specialization that would have been more familiar to conventional military engineers. The psychological impact on survivors manifested in ways that transcended military adaptation. Veterans of the offensive described dreams filled with the texture of Tet lantern silk, snagged on barbed wire, and the taste of rain-diluted rice eaten while mortars thundered beyond temple walls. These weren't just traumatic memories, but cultural fragments from a world that no longer existed, a revolutionary movement that had been as much about preserving Vietnamese tradition as destroying foreign occupation. Communication networks reflected the broader transformation. The improvised radio procedures of early 1968, with their poetic code names and battery rationing that forced operators to share equipment between squads, evolved into standardized military communications using Soviet and Chinese equipment with proper maintenance schedules. The change increased effectiveness, but eliminated the intimate, almost familial quality of earlier networks, where every voice was recognizable and every transmission carried personal history. Rural areas bore witness to the offensive's long-term consequences in ways that rarely appeared in military reports. Villages that had contributed their young men to the Tet attacks found themselves posting casualty lists on banyan trees, names written with bamboo pens in ink that faded with each monsoon. The lists grew longer, as follow-up offensives in May and August consumed what remained of local formations, leaving hamlets with populations skewed toward children and elderly residents who remembered when revolution seemed achievable through local action. The economics of resistance changed as dramatically as its military culture. Finance cadres, who had once collected Tet war taxes in piastres and rice, now dealt with more formal logistics networks supplied by northern infiltration routes. The personal relationships that had sustained village-level resistance, where fighters ate at family tables and slept in ancestral homes, gave way to professional military units that moved through communities without putting down roots. Some adaptations bordered on the surreal. One PAVN unit received orders to seize Saigon's zoo gates and release animals as a diversion, a mission abandoned within minutes when the absurdity became apparent, even to planners desperate for any tactical advantage. The incident captured something essential about the period following Tet, a revolution struggling to maintain relevance, while its fundamental assumptions crumbled under the weight of reality. Women and teenage couriers found their roles changing as military procedures tightened. The informal networks that had allowed girls to move weapons in conical hats and baby cradles evolved into more structured systems with predetermined routes, recognition signals, and backup plans. Effectiveness increased, but the human flexibility that had made Southern resistance so resilient gradually disappeared beneath layers of regulation, designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic losses suffered during Tet. Medical care reflected broader changes in revolutionary priorities. The green tea and traditional remedies that had supplemented captured American supplies gave way to more systematic medical logistics supplied by northern routes. Soviet-manufactured medical equipment replaced the improvised aid stations set up in commandeered kitchens, bringing better treatment at the cost of the intimate, community-based care that had characterized earlier periods. Training camps adopted methods that would have been familiar to conventional armies anywhere in the world. The romanticized image of guerrillas learning warfare through practical experience was replaced by formal instruction in weapons maintenance, communications procedures, and small unit tactics. New recruits received standardized equipment rather than the mixture of captured, improvised, and traditional items that had defined earlier generations of fighters. The psychological profile of recruits changed as dramatically as their equipment. Northern conscripts arrived with different motivations than Southern volunteers who had joined the movement to defend their home villages. The new fighters brought technical skills and military discipline, but they lacked the intimate knowledge of local terrain and population that had made earlier guerrilla operations so effective. Post-Tet revolutionary culture maintained its anti-American focus, while adapting to military realities that demanded conventional organization. The songs and slogans remained, but they now accompanied activities that resembled regular army operations more than the guerrilla warfare that had defined Vietnamese resistance for over a decade. As 1968 drew to a close, the transformation was complete. The Viet Cong who emerged from the Tet Offensive's wreckage bore little resemblance to the movement that had entered it. But perhaps that was always the point. Revolutions, like wars, consume their own children before giving birth to something entirely different. A pre-recorded revolutionary message, intended to announce the liberation of South Vietnam, crackled through a battlefield loudspeaker to an audience of exactly one city block during a brief lull in the fighting. Its grandiose promises of national uprising reduced to propaganda for a handful of shell-shocked civilians huddled behind overturned market stalls. This moment, absurd, tragic, and perfectly symbolic, captured the gap between revolutionary ambition and battlefield reality that defined the Tet Offensive's aftermath. The grand strategy conceived in jungle meeting rooms had fractured into thousands of individual stories of survival, sacrifice, and adaptation that would reshape Vietnamese society for generations. These personal narratives, scattered across urban battlefields from Saigon to Hue, revealed truths about human resilience that transcended military statistics and political analysis. In Cholon, a family had eaten their daily meals for an entire month, just feet above 14 rifles and 300 rounds of ammunition hidden beneath their ancestor altar. The weapons cache, carefully positioned by Viet Cong logistics teams, weeks before the offensive, remained undetected through multiple ARVN searches, protected by the sacred space of family devotion and the soldiers' reluctance to desecrate ancestral shrines. When the fighting finally ended, the family quietly returned the weapons to surviving cadres, never speaking of their unwilling role in revolution's Underground Railroad. The same district witnessed another act of domestic resistance when ARVN troops searched a house where an entire Viet Cong platoon's weapons lay submerged in rain barrels. As soldiers moved through the rooms, questioning the family about suspicious activities, the teenage daughter calmly sat at her dan tran, a traditional 16-string zither, and began playing classical Vietnamese melodies. The haunting music not only masked the subtle slosh of gun oil in water, but created an atmosphere of cultural normalcy that discouraged thorough investigation. The soldiers, perhaps reminded of their own family's musical traditions during Tet celebrations, completed their search without discovering the arsenal floating beneath their feet. These stories of civilian involvement revealed the offensive's most profound impact. It had transformed ordinary Vietnamese families into active participants in a conflict they had hoped to survive through neutrality. Children who had learned to recognize the sound of different weapons could distinguish between AK-47 bursts and M16 automatic fire. Grandmothers who had once worried about rice prices now calculated ammunition weights and storage requirements. The revolution had not just failed to liberate South Vietnam's cities, it had militarized them in ways that would outlast any government. Individual fighters adapted to urban warfare with creativity born of desperation. A sapper squad that had planned to seize Saigon Zoo and release animals as a diversion discovered the absurdity of their mission within minutes of engagement. The idea, presumably conceived by planners who had never seen a panicked elephant or considered the logistics of managing terrified tigers in urban combat, was abandoned so quickly it barely registered in after-action reports. Yet the incident revealed something essential about the period following Tet, a revolution struggling to maintain relevance, while its fundamental assumptions collapsed under contact with reality. The sounds of the city told their own story of transformation. Pagoda drums intended to call Buddhist monks for prayer had been pressed into service as alarm signals, creating confusion for both sides about the source and meaning of various auditory cues. American soldiers learned to distinguish between religious ceremonies and military communications, while Viet Cong fighters had to adapt their traditional signaling methods to avoid triggering responses from nervous ARVN troops who heard revolution in every temple bell. Medical care in the aftermath revealed both innovation and desperation. Viet Cong medical kits that had started the offensive with sulfur powder, green tea, and reused morphine syrets evolved into field hospitals set up in commandeered kitchens, where traditional medicine mixed with captured American supplies. Fighters learned to treat wounds with whatever materials were available: banana leaves for bandages, rice wine for antiseptic, and prayer for anesthesia when nothing else remained. The economic impact extended far beyond military budgets. Viet Cong finance cadres found themselves collecting Tet war taxes from market vendors who had lost most of their inventory to crossfire and looting. A few piastres here, a basket of rice there. These improvised levies generated resentment rather than revolutionary enthusiasm, especially when the fighters collecting them might be dead within days. The revolution that had promised to liberate South Vietnam's workers was extracting tribute from the very people it claimed to represent. Communication networks told stories of adaptation under pressure. Radio operators who had begun the offensive with careful code names like Bamboo, River, and Market found themselves sharing 5 radios between 9 squads, forcing a level of cooperation that went beyond military necessity into the realm of survival. Batteries became more precious than ammunition in some sectors, with operators timing transmissions to maximize their brief windows of contact with higher command. The transformation of revolutionary culture became visible in countless small details. Fighters who had once taken pride in their black Albarbar pajamas and tire-tread sandals now competed for captured American jungle boots and ARVN uniforms that provided better protection and camouflage. The romantic image of peasant guerrillas gave way to the practical reality of soldiers who needed professional equipment to survive professional warfare. Individual acts of heroism and futility played out against this backdrop of cultural change. The taxi driver in Churlawn, who had packed his trunk with explosives beneath mandarin oranges, planning to ram a police post in a climactic act of revolutionary sacrifice, found his martyrdom delayed indefinitely by Saigon's eternal traffic jams. The mundane realities of urban life, congested streets, bureaucratic delays, and simple mechanical failures proved more effective at stopping revolution than government counterintelligence operations. Training methods evolved to incorporate lessons learned in blood. Sapper schools that had once emphasized jungle infiltration now taught wire cutting in ankle-deep water and 100-meter belly crawls through urban debris. The two-breath detonator count practiced under ponchos to simulate the claustrophobic conditions of city warfare became as essential as weapon maintenance for fighters who might need to breach walls while under direct fire. The human cost of this adaptation extended beyond casualty statistics to encompass psychological trauma that would last lifetimes. Survivors wrote of dreams filled with specific textures: Tet lantern silk snagged on barbed wire, the gritty paste of incense ash and brick dust that coated everything in hue, the metallic taste of fear mixed with cordite that seemed to coat their tongues during firefights. Women and children who had served as couriers found their roles evolving as security tightened. The informal networks that had allowed teenagers to move weapons in conical hats and baby cradles gave way to more structured systems with predetermined routes and recognition signals. Effectiveness increased, but the familial quality of earlier resistance networks disappeared beneath layers of military procedure designed to prevent infiltration. As the immediate crisis of the offensive faded into the long war's routine brutality, these individual adaptations became the foundation for everything that followed. The revolution that emerged from Tet's ashes bore little resemblance to the movement that had entered it, but perhaps transformation had always been inevitable for a struggle that demanded everything from its participants. Incense smoke drifted through bullet holes in a Hue pagoda wall as an elderly monk swept brass casings from between prayer mats, each metallic clink against his bamboo broom, marking another life that had passed through his temple on its way to eternity. The Tet Offensive had ended not with triumph or defeat, but with transformation so complete that neither side recognized the war they were now fighting. By December 1968, the conflict that had consumed southern Vietnam's revolutionary movement was being waged by different armies using different methods for different objectives. The black pajamas and tire-tread sandals that had symbolized indigenous resistance were museum pieces, replaced by the olive-drab uniforms and rubber boots of northern regulars, who brought their own version of Vietnamese nationalism to a struggle they had inherited rather than created. The human toll transcended military statistics in ways that would reshape Vietnamese society for generations. Many Viet Cong villages found themselves with populations skewed toward children and elderly residents, their young men memorialized in lists pinned to banyan trees with names written in ink that faded with each monsoon. 5 to 10 casualties per hamlet, numbers that seemed modest, until multiplied across thousands of communities that had contributed their sons to revolution's altar. Individual survivors carried trauma that defied comprehension or treatment. Veterans described the specific texture of Tet lantern silk snagged on barbed wire, the taste of rain-diluted rice eaten while mortars thumped beyond temple walls, and the way incense ash mixed with brick dust to create a gritty paste that coated everything in Hugh's ancient courtyards. These weren't just memories, but sensory imprints that would resurface decades later, in quiet moments when the smell of burning incense or the sound of distant fireworks triggered flashbacks to urban warfare. The strategic victory that emerged from tactical disaster revealed itself slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Walter Cronkite's February 27th broadcast declaring the war a stalemate had achieved what 30,000 dead fighters could not. It broke American confidence in their government's war aims. President Johnson's March 31st announcement that he would not seek re-election represented a political earthquake, triggered by farmers' sons who had died in embassy courtyards and city streets, their sacrifice achieving strategic objectives none of them lived to witness. The transformation of revolutionary culture became visible in countless details that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Women who had served as couriers, moving weapons in conical hats and baby cradles, found themselves relegated to support roles as military procedures tightened around formal command structures. The intimate, familial networks that had sustained village-level resistance gave way to professional military units that moved through communities without establishing the personal relationships that had once defined Vietnamese resistance. Communication systems reflected broader changes in revolutionary priorities. The poetic codenames bamboo, river, Market that had characterized earlier radio networks were replaced by numerical designations and standardized procedures that increased security at the cost of the human connection that had made operators instantly recognizable to their comrades. Batteries were no longer shared between squads in acts of improvised cooperation. They were distributed according to logistical schedules maintained by Northern supply officers who had never learned the intimate geography of Southern resistance. Finance operations evolved from the personal relationships that had allowed cadres to collect Tet war taxes from market vendors they had known since childhood to more formal systems that treated local populations as sources of revenue rather than members of an extended revolutionary family. The change increased efficiency but eliminated the voluntary cooperation that had once made taxation feel like community investment in liberation rather than extraction by an occupying force. Training camps adopted methods that prepared fighters for conventional warfare rather than the guerrilla operations that had defined Vietnamese resistance since the struggle against French colonialism. New recruits learned standardized weapons maintenance, formal communications procedures, and small unit tactics that would have been familiar to regular armies anywhere in the world. The romantic image of peasant guerrillas learning warfare through practical experience was replaced by technical instruction that emphasized discipline over innovation. The medical transformation paralleled broader changes in revolutionary organization. Traditional remedies, green tea, sulfur powder, and improvised equipment gave way to standardized medical logistics supplied by northern infiltration routes. Treatment improved, but the community-based care that had characterized earlier periods disappeared beneath layers of military procedure that prioritized effectiveness over the personal touch that had once made revolution feel like an extension of family obligation. Individual adaptations revealed the human dimension of this broader transformation. Sapper teams that had once improvised explosive devices from bamboo tubes and captured American grenades now received standardized demolition equipment with detailed instruction manuals. The creativity born of desperation gave way to technical competence that increased lethality while eliminating the personal investment that had made each improvised weapon a work of deadly art. The economic impact of the offensive extended far beyond immediate military costs to encompass social changes that would outlast any government. Villages that had contributed their young men to the attacks found themselves dependent on remittances from relatives who had fled to cities or foreign countries. The agricultural communities that had sustained Vietnamese resistance for generations gradually hollowed out as war consumed their human capital and mechanized farming reduced demand for rural labor. Urban areas bore psychological scars that would influence Vietnamese culture for decades. Children who had learned to distinguish between different weapons by sound alone grew up in a militarized environment where civilian and military life blended into something new and unprecedented. The revolution had not just failed to liberate South Vietnam's cities, it had transformed them into spaces where ordinary families navigated daily life around the infrastructure of permanent conflict. The spiritual dimension of the transformation manifested in ways that transcended political analysis. Pagoda drums that had once called monks to prayer had been pressed into service as military signals, confusing traditional religious practice with revolutionary communication. The sacred and profane merged in temples where ancient Buddhas watched modern warfare with serene indifference, their golden faces reflecting muzzle flashes and tracer rounds that illuminated centuries-old architectural details. As 1968 ended and 1969 began, the war that emerged from Tet's ashes bore little resemblance to the conflict that had preceded it. Northern main force units increasingly filled roles once played by Southern guerrillas, bringing different motivations, different methods, and different relationships with local populations. The intimate knowledge of terrain and community that had made earlier resistance so effective was replaced by technical competence and formal military training that emphasized efficiency over emotional connection. The psychological profile of fighters reflected this broader transformation. Northern conscripts arrived with motivations shaped by abstract nationalism rather than the personal grievances that had driven Southern volunteers to join the movement. They brought technical skills and military discipline but lacked the family networks and local knowledge that had sustained guerrilla operations for over a decade. Perhaps most significantly, the offensive had revealed the limits of revolutionary warfare when applied to urban environments controlled by conventional military forces. The romantic notion that peasant guerrillas could defeat professional armies through superior motivation had died in the streets of Saigon and the courtyards of Hue, replaced by the grim recognition that revolution required the same resources and organization as any other form of warfare. The Tet Offensive, seen from Viet Cong eyes, mixed incense and cordite, hope for uprising, and the hard arithmetic of losses measured in platoons and blocks. But its ultimate legacy lay not in what it achieved, but in what it destroyed and what rose from those ashes. As the last smoke cleared from urban battlefields where revolution had consumed itself, new kinds of fighters were already moving south along jungle trails, carrying different weapons and different dreams toward a war that would be won by methods the Tet generation never imagined.